Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture Q&A, brought to you by you. I asked on my Instagram and also on my Chinese social media if anyone had some questions about British culture, and happily lots of people gave me suggestions, and I've picked the few that piqued my interest the most. First of all, thank you to Bond Up North on Instagram, Sam, who asked me, how do you feel being in the UK after 2 years? I'll start from this, and then I'll just go through in no particular order all the other questions that struck me. First, the most personal. So yes, I've been in the UK for just over 2 years, and again, chatting with my Chinese friends about this topic, a lot of us found work-life balance to be one of the biggest differences between the UK and China, where I lived for 6 years, and I stay in touch with many of my friends there. So in China, work was my life, and that's the case for many people, both Chinese and expatriates. Most of my friends and relationships very much depended on my job. Whereas here in the UK, I've got my church, a local political community, and of course my Bond bros, and I can actually hang out with friends I had before, friends I've made at different jobs, friends I've made at, from university and even primary school. Very different from just hanging out in calls. Now, I should say my actual work wasn't too good. In fact, I'll cut that story short and say I've resigned. My newsletter subscribers are already aware of this. The link to my newsletter should be in the show notes or whatever app you're listening on. I could talk more, but in short, I am so much happier and more relaxed now. But unlike before, when I was an expat living overseas, it doesn't affect where I live. I don't have a visa tied to my employer. I've got consistency in most other areas of my life, and as above, I've got the opportunity of change. And for me, a change in work is an improvement in itself. Even if it's much the same as before, change is an improvement. But again, changing my work has not changed all the friends and relationships and everything else that goes with it, and that's good. So there's that element of work-life balance. There's the general environment. Now, I live in a semi-rural kind of town/village, and instead of walking as I did in Shenzhen to the metro, and of course China does have issues with air pollution and so on, instead of that built-up city in China, I was living in a city of 14 million people minimum. It's thought to be 17 to 20 million people in reality now. It's very built up. Rather like the mega cities in Judge Dredd, actually. But there you've got the public transport, there's huge infrastructure for the metro. Of course, that might be similar to living in London, but I don't live in London. I live very far north in West Yorkshire. And, of course, in the USA, it was cars everywhere, even drive-through banks and all that kind of thing. So here, everything's set up for walking. So I can walk out to the countryside very happily. In 10 minutes I'll be among all the sheep and all the cows. Or I can take 10 minutes walk to a train station and get into a larger town, larger city. But just a normal day here, you'll easily get your 10,000 steps. It's built in, unless of course you're working from home, which I have been. Anyway, the UK is very much set up for walking, and I really like that. And lots of people have been commenting on, well, how much healthier I see him going back to the UK. One thing that a lot of expats returning, I was away from the UK for almost 7 years, in fact more than 7 years, is normalcy. So lots of people find this very difficult. If they're returning, they have that reverse culture shock. Now, I have to say, I didn't find that so much this time. I've had it before. I found it very strange coming back to the UK after I lived 7 years in Turkish Cyprus. But having lived 7 years in, China, US, I didn't feel this. I don't feel a misfit here. Perhaps because when I left, it was more carrot than stick. I was leaving for China because I really liked the job that I was being offered, so I went for that. I didn't really stay in touch with the UK in the first couple of years, but as I was starting to realise it's time to get back, I did make a determined effort to start to learn more about the UK, and perhaps it helps that I've done it before and I've got the mindset I'm coming to a new country. I very rarely think I'm coming back to an old country. So because I think this is a new country, I make the most of my time here, whether it's little day trips or whether making sure I've got local connections or making sure I learn things about the town I'm in. I think that really helps build that sense of normalcy. And a few other thoughts. My friend Alex Lamas also pointed out the wonderful nature of British humour. All countries have a sense of humour. It does, however, vary in its specifics. I do like British humour. I like the self-deprecation lots of Brits have. I do like the manners. Not so keen on the negativity. There's a lot more negativity in British culture, but only really about minor things. When it's a crisis, that all stops. But day to day, I think lots of Brits do like to complain. So that's one thing I don't really appreciate, because I don't really have it myself, I don't think. Having said that, I'm saying what I don't like, which is the negativity. But I do enjoy the humour, self-deprecation, and manners. But overall, work-life balance, environment, normalcy, it's all been pretty positive, and I feel very lucky because I know that not all expats adjust as swiftly as I have. This next question is from the Instagrammer License to Lift, and just from that Instagram handle you might be able to guess, this is on a fitness topic. He asks, how is your Bond fitness challenge going? It's not. Although I mentioned the walking, sure, I love walking and I'll go for the occasional run. Fitness focus for me has been varying very much over the last 6 months, the last summer. Really focused on it. But my focus has been on family right now, and of course it's time. So desperately focus on the work, as was, and now I've stepped away from that. I'm focusing on family and a few other things like doing this. At some point it will come back, but I'm not a fitness fanatic, although I do like to keep in shape. Got to fit those suits. I mentioned old friends. An old friend I won't name, but an old friend sent me the dangerous question, what is your favourite British sitcom from the 1980s? My goodness. Now, I didn't think anybody would give me another opportunity to talk about Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, but somebody has, and I'm afraid you must all suffer the consequences. Got here in my hands the complete Yes Prime Minister by Jonathan Lynn and Anthony J, which I absolutely love the book as well as the TV show. And normally I've read from the Yes Minister scripts. I really like the Yes Prime Minister one. The book of the TV show is written as if it was the memoirs of Jim Hacker. I'll read out from the first regular episode of Yes Prime Minister after his elevation, which was by party machinations rather than a general election, which of course happened to John Major, Gordon Brown and several PMs recently. Does not include the current Sir Keir Starmer, who won a general election. The Prime Minister, of course, is the leader of the largest political parliamentary party. So, of course, if the parliamentary party changes leader, you get a new Prime Minister, if it's the largest. So, Yes Prime Minister, the grand design, Jim Hacker writes, the last few days have been overwhelmingly exciting. I went to the palace and kissed hands. The next morning I moved into number 10. I'd read in the memoirs of past Prime Ministers that the staff line up in the front lobby and in the long stair corridor inside it that leads down to the grand central staircase and applaud the incoming Prime Minister. I wonder why they didn't applaud me, and I hope it does not bode ill. Editor's note. This accolade is only granted traditionally to a Prime Minister who has just won a general election. Back to Jim Hacker's writings. It took a day or two to move in. The PM lives in a flat above the shop, and the whole building is extremely confusing. From the outside it looks like an average Georgian terrace house, but inside it is absolutely huge, a small, stately home, a mini palace. This is because it is, in reality, 2 houses. Not 2 houses side by side. The Chancellor of the Exchequer lives in number 11. The 2 houses that almost back onto each other, joined by corridors, stairwells and courtyards. Each house has 5 or 6 floors, and the house at the back has large, elegant staterooms for entertaining my subjects. Editor's note. Hacker was plainly suffering from delusions of grandeur and was confusing himself with the monarch. Back to Jim. The main problem in finding one's way around number 10 is that because it's two different houses, because of subsidence during the war, and because the ground slopes away towards the back, it's almost impossible to know what floor you're on once you're upstairs. But my confusion on moving in was nothing like my state of mind today, my fifth in office, on being taken to the top-secret operations room below the Ministry of Defence. It looked just like you'd expect. Maps of the 5 continents, girls at video terminals, officers at desks, are shown around by the Chief of the General Staff, Sir Geoffrey Howard, a tall, dapper chap with sandy hair, bushy eyebrows, and a brisk, commanding voice. Sir Humphrey and Bernard were hovering about as always. Naturally, my first question was about the hotline. The General looked puzzled. Which one? To Russia. Ah, that's in Downing Street, the General told me. I glanced at Bernard. Why hadn't I been shown it? He looked surprised. Perhaps he hadn't been shown it either. I continued, so if there's an emergency, can I get straight through to the Soviet President? Theoretically, yes, General Howard replied, cautiously. Does that mean no? Well, it's what we tell journalists. In fact, we did once get through to the Kremlin, but only to a switchboard operator. Couldn't the operator put you through? We couldn't find out. She didn't seem to speak much English. How often is it tested? The General looked blank. Testing had clearly not occurred to him. They try not to test it too often, Humphrey intervened smoothly. It tends to create unnecessary panic at the other end, and panic is always a good thing to avoid where nuclear weapons are concerned. Don't you think? I certainly do. I shall stop the reading there, although I could read it for my own satisfaction all day. I love this series, particularly when it gets to Yes, Prime Minister, because as the series became more and more successful, more and more people well-connected started to leak information to the writers. And so there's whole websites devoted to the release of 30-year papers. British government papers are generally kept secret for 30 years, at which point they're released, unless they contain sensitive information that pertains to the current day, in which case they might be held for 30, 40, 50 years. However, 30-year papers have been released, and of course this is a 1980s series, so quite frequently you can find that plot lines have been based very, very directly on actual events, taken to absurd extremes, of course, by the end of each episode, but nonetheless you can find what they're genuinely based on, and sometimes with information changed for security purposes or for polite political purposes. But I do very much enjoy this series, and appreciating it is humorous, it is satire. I do think nonetheless it gives a very good insight into the workings of British government at large. The next topic was sent in by Sam at British Bond Fan, a different Sam, who asked simply, why are Vikings so popular? I really like this question. Every decade has its own in-rebel. At one point it was cowboys, at another point the spy against the faceless system, whether it was James Bond or The Prisoner in the 1960s, rather surreal TV show. Pirates were popular for a long time, and now it's Vikings, whether it's the Vikings TV show on Netflix, whether it's video games like God of War, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, or Marvel movies like Thor and Loki and so on. I couldn't resist looking at Quora and Reddit to see what's their take on why Vikings are so popular. There's a strong narrative that in the USA there's lots of young white men looking for some kind of cool history to identify with. Vikings are cool, they got around, mixed heritage works as they were travelling to new lands. That seems part of their culture, from Northern Europe to Istanbul. Lots of Americans might be part German, part Swedish, part white, don't know, and Vikings can be a kind of common uniting thread. They are popular in Europe as well. And it's also fair to say that because the Vikings left relatively little evidence of themselves, we are therefore free to romanticise, imagine, and mythologise them. And of course they did have a rich mythology. There has been a nationalist hint lately. Those into modern nationalism are often into Vikings, maybe far right. Various heavy metal bands have been accused of leaning into this. Many of them refute it, not all. There's a whole subgenre of Viking metal bands. Books have indeed been written on this. And also there's other dead languages that have got into metal, Latin, and many other mythologies. However, Vikings have been very, very well represented. For this, I thought I'd pick up another of my favourite books. I very much enjoy old history books. We have our modern way of looking at history, often by looking at modern problems and tracing them back to history. But of course the problems in the past were different, and therefore the histories of the past were different. So I've got a book published, I think, first in 1950. It's called A Portrait of Britain in the Middle Ages by Mary R. Price, published by Oxford. And I just really enjoy this, because this is how the 1950s viewed history. It may be different from how we view it today, but then again, in a fair few decades we'll probably be viewing history differently again. So, I'll get straight to the reading.
The purpose of this podcast really is to highlight living here in Spain and to cover what we decided is really what we're passionate about: food, fashion, and fun places.
Absolutely.
That either we have visited or are going to visit.
We are going to be going to Madrid very soon. Mm-hmm. We're going to be exploring the brand Loewe. We'll be exploring a little more about the Costa Blanca. Won't reveal exactly where in the Costa Blanca just yet.
I get excited about those things, so I thought, wow, I really want to share it with other people.
By the end of the 8th century, there was comparative peace in England. Indeed, the English in this century were actually civilizing the people of Germany, and we may say that they were the most peaceful, as well as the most important of all the peoples of Western Europe. The descendants of the one-time raiders, the Anglo-Saxons, had settled down in the 7 kingdoms called Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex, and few remembered that their forefathers had ever lived anywhere else. The remaining Britons stayed in Cornwall, Wales, and the Lake District, fighting among themselves but not interfering much with the rest of the country. But there were still 2 more waves of invaders to come before William and his Normans, and in AD 793 the first of these arrived. Long black ships with bright shields hung along the gunwales and filled with fighting men appeared off the unprotected coasts in the east and south. They came from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and the tough pagan warriors they carried were known as Northmen or Vikings. England was only one of the countries which these Northmen attacked. Some went way of the Baltic Sea to Russia, and then south to Constantinople. Others braved the Bay of Biscay and reached the Mediterranean, and the most daring of all sailed to Iceland and Greenland, and landed 500 years before Columbus on the coast of North America. England, Scotland, Ireland, and France bore the brunt of their attacks. Like the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes before them, they first came only as raiders, but later, attracted by the green and fertile country, began to settle. The 7 English kingdoms struggled and fought against them, but soon lay as helpless as the Britons had 500 years before. Not until the Northmen had been doing their worst for nearly 100 years did anyone in England offer really stiff resistance. In the year 871, a young man called Alfred became King of Wessex. Although he was only 23, and all his life was delicate and ailing, he rallied the despairing English under his standard of the Golden Dragon, and beat the Northmen out of his own kingdom, and eastward across the Roman road called Watling Street, which runs from London to Chester. Not content with this, Alfred determined to protect Wessex from further attacks. He built a fleet, the first English king to do so, of ships longer and swifter than the Northmen's. He built boroughs, or fortified towns, at intervals along his boundaries. He also began a new method of calling up men for his army. It was not enough, he thought, faced with the dangers of the Northmen, to rely solely on his royal men-at-arms and personal followers. All Englishmen should be ready to help if necessary. So, he ordered that every man, save only cripples, young boys, and the very old, must have a spear, a helmet, and a shield, and be ready to fight. This army was called the Fjord, and was rather like the territorial army is today, except that everybody had to belong to it. Alfred died in 899. He was not only a soldier, but a civilizer too. He founded schools, rebuilt ruined monasteries, and caused the laws and customs of his land to be collected and written down. For nearly 80 years his sons and grandsons went on fighting the Northmen and gradually subdued them, so the kings of Wessex became the kings of all England, and the Northmen settled down among the English. I shall end here my reading of A Portrait of Britain in the Middle Ages by Mary R. Price. A very, very entertaining book. An easy read, and one that I read many years ago that got me very interested in English history. I don't think we'd write it like that today, civilised and uncivilised, all things being relative. The Anglo-Saxons, as acknowledged, had been invaders too, and who can say these days who was right? But perhaps some things can be said. The Anglo-Saxons had settled. My Irish ancestry is only a few generations back, but I don't really feel Irish. I'm British. I have a podcast on British culture. And the Anglo-Saxons had been in England for a few hundred years more than my family has now. They had built, their achievements evident, they had laws, they had customs, and the Vikings presented a very real existential threat to these. It can seem less brutal and less barbaric today as it is at a distance, but if I had a choice between having the settled Anglo-Saxons as a next-door neighbour in the flats where I live, or a Viking chieftain, I'd certainly want an Alfred. The Vikings are more fun on screen, though. Shall move on to my next question, which was from Francisco Trevelyan on Instagram. He just asked me about Narnia. He suggested this as a topic, and Narnia affects my life. Often when people are aware of my Turkish connections, well, they talk to me about how disappointed they are by Turkish delight. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Edmund tries this from Jadis the White Witch, reputedly half jinn, half giant. And Edmund loves Turkish delight. Then, of course, in the real world, British children try Cadbury's Turkish delight and are horribly, horribly disappointed. Fair enough. It is rubbish compared to actual Turkish delight in Turkey, known as lokum. C.S. Lewis has a few Turkish references in the Narnia books. Aslan, of course, is the Turkish word for lion, for example. And the White Witch is said to be half jinn, an otherworldly spirit, kind of related to the genie. The 2005 Disney movie leaned into this with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, with its various evil characters wearing Ottoman-inspired armour. I really enjoyed that version. C.S. Lewis himself is a very, very interesting man, a Protestant from Northern Ireland, famously friends with J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a Catholic from England. Both of them were kind of outsiders, or at least minorities from their larger communities, the Catholic being a minority within England, and a Protestant being a minority within Ireland. And I wonder if that influenced their interesting perspectives on different cultures and travel, and certainly they spoke about it and wrote about it a great deal. C.S. Lewis, of course, wrote On Christianity, which is the book that I'd gravitate to, rather than his Narnia books. Again, much as I enjoy different adaptations, especially the BBC ones, actually. Funnily enough, I'm told that's very popular with Christian households in the USA, the old BBC adaptation of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. But I'll read a little extract from C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. Part 1, The Law of Human Nature. Everyone has heard people quarrelling. Sometimes it sounds funny and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant, but however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this: how do you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine, come on. You promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behaviour does not please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behaviour which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldomly replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not rarely go against the standard, have to be some special excuse. He pretends that there is some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when it was given to him, a bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behaviour or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they rarely agreed, and they have. If they had not, they might of course fight like animals, and they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarrelling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong, and there would be no sense in trying to do that, unless you and he had some sort of agreement about what was right and what was wrong, just as there would be no sense in saying that a footballer had committed a foul unless there was an agreement about the rules of football. I shall skip a section here for brevity. This particular piece ends with this thought. There are 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave that way. They know the law of nature. They break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. Well, the book is called Mere Christianity, so I suggest that the one point is about the existence of God and divine justice, and the other point would be about sin. C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. The next topic, again suggested by a Sam, this time the first Sam at Bond Up North, who asked me to talk about British food. This suggestion was sent some time ago. Personally, I hear 2 claims as I travel abroad, and oddly, I do actually hear them in the UK, as my experience. First, that British food is terrible, and second, that British food isn't really British. To the first point, that British food is terrible, I find this funny, because people who say this sometimes will admit, actually, the British food I tried was really, really nice. One of my friends who's Chinese came to the UK, and I was a bit anxious, actually, because there's all this talk about British food being terrible. I took her to an East Yorkshire seaside town, famed for its seafood, but my Chinese friend is from a place in China also famed for its seafood. She said it was lovely, she said it was great, she said it was fantastic, but I watched carefully. She did have more. She ordered more. So there's this joke that it's terrible. My friend loved it. People will often say that English food is terrible, but they'll love an English breakfast, except for one friend of mine who found it far too filling. Some people try it in London, and to be fair, in my 2021 episode, Not Just London with Kane, we both agreed that London has really the worst English breakfast, so you really want to get out of London and try it somewhere else. I will note that the English breakfast in England does not have English muffins. They're not a thing in England because they're an American thing named after a Thomas English, not in reference to the country. Also, anyone I know who's just trying afternoon tea tends to enjoy it. It's usually found in touristy areas rather than just anywhere in the UK, but they do tend to be well-to-do areas as well. So, afternoon tea, English breakfast, British seafood, not just fish and chips, but a whole variety of British seafood, seems to be voted for by a variety of friends, both English and those from further afield. But it's not how we see ourselves. We don't rest our culture on our food. And of course our food culture is famously impacted by the Second World War, when we had lots of American visitors who disliked the food. But of course we've been through years and years of, well, privations. Years before that, the Victorians were the most adventurous. Foods and spices were brought from all over the world to homes of modest means. After all, the Romans showed how civilized they were by bringing foods from all over their empire, so how could educated Brits not do the same? And of course, in recent years, decades, there has been a rediscovery, whether it's Nigella Lawson or Heston Blumenthal or a range of other TV chefs. So I'd say that's something that's changed a great deal. There's really only one point in history, perhaps, but it's not something that we say we're proud of our food. It's just not where we rest our cultural identity. I think we put it more into our history. The second claim is that British food isn't really British. Well, Irish food famously revolves around potatoes, which are from the New World. Is Indian food Indian? Well, chili peppers are from Mexico via the Portuguese. Naan bread is from Central Asia. Tomatoes are embraced by all cuisines in India, but actually from South America. And there's a lot of British Indian food that's been re-imported into the subcontinent, much like me encountering fortune cookies in China, which of course were created in Chinese-American restaurants, but they got re-imported. And again, is Italian food Italian? Imagine Italian food with no tomato. There's a great deal of sharing in all our cuisines. As I come towards the end, I'll go through a highlight of other topics. I mentioned those contacting me by Instagram, those contacting me by my Chinese social media. I'd just like to say a special mention to those who contacted me via the YouTube comment section, which is always entertaining. Hello to Samuel Leask, especially for all of your comments. I won't respond to any one of them, but I appreciate all of them. Equally, I've had a few anonymous comments on YouTube. So one anonymous one on my introduction video, What is Britishness? Someone said, "You're so right, Thomas, when you say as you learn another culture, you naturally reflect on your own. It reminds me of Kipling's line, what do they of England who only England know? What is Britishness? Well, I'd say it's kindness, laughing at ourselves, wet streets, pubs and cricket. There we are, question answered." I think that's a very good answer, and Kipling is one of my favourite authors. Again, in English outside, he spent much of his life in India. Another person commenting said, "I love the fact that Britain has a very multi-generational approach when dealing with culture. While it works towards preserving the history and traditions of its people across various regions and local landscapes, as we see in examples such as the revival of folk music, Britain also has a way of making new ventures and exploring diversity, especially as it now becomes a global country." I really like that. I think a good example of never throw anything away is that telephone boxes are not removed just because they're not needed. Instead, each community finds a use for them. First aid sections, book exchanges, Wi-Fi points. I really find that interesting. And finally, well, just 2-3 quick questions on James Bond. Of course, that's how I've connected with many people around the world. Mr. Harris, hello, you've asked me, what is it you love about the Bond films the most? Well, I love the films really because I love the books. I really enjoy the Ian Fleming books, and it's after really coming to love them that I went back to the films and fell in love with the films, which I do just see as kind of an Arthurian tale. M as Arthur, Q as Merlin, a whole host of monsters and maidens. You start out with an equilibrium, then there's turmoil, and then there's equilibrium again. No hero's journey required. I've been rereading Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and I have to say I don't think this is really one of those hero's journeys that's required. Just the mission is fantastic, and I think some of the continuation novels, which again I do enjoy the books, so the continuation novels, sometimes they're more influenced by the films, like Raymond Benson, who ties in both book and film, and Charlie Higson's, which leaned, I think, fairly close towards the movie interpretation, but I've really enjoyed those two continuation novels. Sam, the British Bond fan, these are two different Sams, asked me, which Bond outfit would you love to have made for you? Which one is your favourite? Again, when I lived in China, I had quite a few outfits made for me, quite a few suits and shirts and so on. I do have one of my favourite looks from all the James Bond films, which is Tomorrow Never Dies, Hamburg suit. It's a 3-button charcoal suit with a ticket pocket. I really like that. I also have one based on the Quantum of Solace pre-titles, but again with each of these I'll change something. So with the Tomorrow Never Die suit, that's a 1990s film, it's got a 1990s look. Mine is a bit more modern in its fit. And the Quantum of Solace suit, like many of the more recent Bond films, the suit is a 3-button suit that has a roll, so it looks like a 2-button suit, but actually does have 3 buttons. I prefer just a 2-button suit or just a 3-button suit. I don't particularly enjoy that roll. If you're not sure what that is, do check out the blog site bondsuits.com. It's a great website, or of course From Tailors with Love, one of my favourite books. But British Bond fan did ask me, what do I want? So that implies something I don't have, just probably a dog tooth suit, which is from the literary Bond. I also don't have a navy suit, and probably need some thicker suits, but we'll see what my next job is, and what that leads on to. Final question was from Jason Kim, who asked me my predictions for Bond 26, and when it might come out. He was suggesting 2028, 2030. I find it very difficult to do that kind of prediction game. I'll say what I'd like. I think 2028 would be great. I'd like a modern day adventure. I think it dates better, oddly enough. I think a lot of things set in the past are often more a reflection of when it was made than when it's supposed to be set, so I find things set in the modern day tend to date better over time. High-end stuff is a lot easier if it's in the modern day. Amiga's happy to donate their latest model rather than an out-of-date model. That leaves the filmmakers to focus on the free stuff. Also, there's no reader's notes needed, like which historical character is this supposed to be, and the stakes can feel higher. If it's set in the past, you kind of feel you know how it ends. Whether it's cinematic or televisual, I don't have a very strong view on this. I'd be interested in a Mandalorian-style TV show. I'd like it to be about Bond rather than an ancillary character. I definitely want a video game. I think it's about time James Bond put out a decent video game, and if any names of specific individuals are needed, my top name to be attached to the project is actually David Arnold, the composer, because I think he'd be brilliant for the music. Thank you very much. That's all the topics. That's all my answers. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. A lot about Britishness, and 3 books. C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity, a portrait of medieval Britain, and of course, the book of Yes, Prime Minister. Those are my recommendations for reading. I hope you enjoy this podcast. Goodbye.